Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Michael Levitin in conversation with Michael Howerton. My name's Jamie Madsen. I'm the marketing and events coordinator here at Copperfields, and I'll also be your host for the evening. So I want to take a moment here in the beginning and thank all of you for your continued support of our events program. Your purchases make this whole thing possible. So we at Copperfields are very, very grateful. And just a couple of items to note before we get started. Go ahead and keep an eye on your chat box tonight. I will be using this during the event to provide details about tonight's title, links to previous titles by Michael, discount codes, and the like. So keep an eye on the chat box there. And additionally, the format will feature between 35 to 45 minutes of speaking and will be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the right-hand corner, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. Please go ahead and submit your questions and comments here rather than replying to my posts in the chat box, and thank you. So now I'm really excited to introduce tonight's author, Michael Levitin. Michael is a journalist and a co-founding editor of the Occupy Wall Street Journal. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Guardian, Newsweek, Time, and the Los Angeles Times, among many other publications. He teaches journalism at Diablo Valley College in the San Francisco East Bay, where he lives with his partner and daughter. And in conversation with Michael tonight is Michael Howerton. Michael is a writer and journalist who has taught at UC Berkeley, the College of New Jersey, and Berkeley City College. He is the editorial director of the Diatribe Foundation and the former editor-in-chief of Granite Media, as well as the San Francisco Examiner. So they are with us tonight to discuss Michael's brand new title, Generation Occupy, Reawakening American Democracy. I know we're all excited to hear this conversation tonight, so let's dive in. I'm gonna hand it straight over to you, Michael. Why don't you take it away for us?
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Michael.
Good to see you. Congratulations on a new book. And thank you very much for Copperfields for this evening event. And welcome to all of our guests out there. Nice to have you with us. Michael, do you want to start off by reading a little bit from your book?
I will, and I'll read very shortly. It's a matter of about 4 paragraphs. It is just the opening of the book that will initiate our discussion, I hope, and give a flavor of what it's about. So the first chapter is called Occupy Generation. A decade after Occupy Wall Street ignited a discussion about wealth inequality, corporate greed, and the corrupting influence of money in politics, people still ask, what happened to Occupy? The movement that sprang to life in Lower Manhattan on September 17th, 2011, the 224th anniversary of the signing of the US Constitution, sparked occupations in 1,000 towns and cities that seemed for several months to rewire America's political DNA. Polls showed 2/3 of the country backed the ideas and principles of the movement, and for a brief autumn, Occupy captured the global stage as its message resonated around the world. And then, like a storm, it was over. Collapsed both from its own lack of structure and from the state violence that suppressed it, Occupy vanished almost as quickly as it had arrived. One thing most people remember is that Occupy introduced the vocabulary of the 99% and the 1%, putting the crisis of inequality on the map. But that was about it. The movement created no electoral organization, achieved no legislative success, and made no real impact on American political life, or so the storyline went. To date, no one has provided an accurate answer to the question, what happened to Occupy? I would contend we are no longer the country we were before Occupy Wall Street revived the labor movement, remade the Democratic Party, and reinvented activism, birthing a new culture of protest that put the fight for economic and social justice at the forefront of a generation. Far from a passing phenomenon, Occupy inaugurated an era of political change in which the demands of the majority continue to grow louder and more focused. It began with the kids. The kids came out and they didn't go home. They targeted Wall Street, the source of our dysfunctional democracy, and issued a singular demand that was all of the demands: justice, fairness, equality. Their slogan, "We are the 99%, inspired hundreds of thousands to move away from their screens and into the streets and squares, where the vision of Occupy replaced the unfulfilled promise of Obama's hope and change. They had no leaders. There was no plan. This was not a protest. It was a rebellion, a revolt whose time had come. The seeds they planted took root overnight and quickly spread and multiplied, germinating in the country's consciousness. No one thought young people would remain camped out in parks forever, nor did anyone expect the movement to reshape the political and cultural arenas in the ways that it did. I didn't come to New York looking for a revolution. I came to catch a flight leaving JFK for Berlin, where I had a wife waiting to divorce me. I believe in the adage that when one door closes, another one opens. It may not be the one you expect, but the trick is to walk through it anyway. Perhaps I had been waiting for Occupy. We had all, to some degree, been waiting for it. And when it finally appeared, I felt I had no choice. It was right there in front of us, staring our generation in the eyes, daring us to act as no moment ever had, to put our convictions and our bodies on the line. We weren't used to doing such things, our generation. You could call us the Obama generation. The iPhone generation works too. We were the anti-globalization and the millennial generation, the unaffordable rent and college debt generation. We were also, of course, the September 11, Iraq War, financial crisis, and Great Recession generation. We were the Occupy generation, Generation Occupy.
Thank you. So, Michael, as you just illustrated in that opening section of the book, you, and in the course of the whole book, you kind of keep up the weaving in and out of your own personal story and kind of the grander story of Occupy as a movement, both domestically and globally. So just, I'm curious if you could just start off by telling us what your personal connection to Occupy was and how you kind of blended your own personal story with Occupy with the broader story of the movement in the last decade. What followed that initial protest in New York?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't intend, as I said in the introduction, it wasn't the plan to go to Occupy. I was driving across country. I wound up there, and I really, the moment though, several days before the plane that I was supposed to get on, I was so taken by the movement. I was kind of struck by the intensity of it, by something I had never seen before. I'd been covering protest movements. I started by covering the anti-corporate, one of the anti-globalization movements in Bolivia, the water war against a San Francisco corporation that had privatized their water. I had covered, G7 and sort of those movements, but nothing resembled this new generational voice that emerged really organically there. And I just felt I had to stay and be part of it. It pulled me in a sense that I wasn't really, like I say, I was drawn, and it was beyond sort of, I had to do that. But what I could offer the movement, I'm not an organizer. I was an activist as a younger guy, but what I really could bring and help was journalism, was my writing and editing background. And, everybody looked for a way to contribute at the movement. And mine became quite clearly early on to help. I helped co-found the newspaper, the Occupied Wall Street Journal. And it really anchored my experience there to try to articulate and broaden the movement's reach by really explaining to the 99%, to people in the streets and across the country and through our media, what were its demands? What was it doing? But then to write this book was really the challenge, which I think any journalist, and I also as a teacher of journalism, talk to students about objectivity. You clearly we're not objective as observers. We try to be, but the most important thing is to write sort of with an appearance of objectivity, even when you feel strongly about something. So I was very committed and passionate, and I still am, to the ideas in the book. But I really had to step back, and I wrote the book in kind of a two-voice. There are vignettes that bring readers into the scene because I wanted people to, 10 years later, as we read it today, experience being there the way that I sort of experienced it with fresh eyes, and bring people to those descriptive moments of what it felt like to be there. But those are really more of the side chapters. The main story is the analysis and history and what Occupy, based on so many interviews I did, talking with people in recent years, what it brought us. And those were the two elements that I balanced and tried to tell objectively as possible, and as fairly and honestly in a voice as possible.
It's a kind of it's a very impressive hybrid creation of, it's neither a dispassionate journalistic account, as you say, nor just a pure memoir of your experiences. And yeah, it does kind of lend a propulsive power to getting through. I'm just curious, you kind of happened upon Occupy, and you kind of talked about that in the opening segment that you read, but you stayed, and kind of just quickly, why were you compelled to stay with Occupy, and why did it speak to you, as you said?
I think maybe more, I'll pivot. I mean, that was back then, 10 years ago. Why I felt compelled maybe to tell this story right now might be more of the relevant sort of, I felt compelled to stay there because I felt it was the moment that our generation finally showed up. I mean, I called this book Generation Occupy. It didn't have that title. I worked on it for years. After Occupy ended, I spent several years sort of, well, 1 year for sure, kind of recovering from the intensity of it, but also trying to write about it for 2 or 3 years steadily, but it was much too personal. I stepped back, I worked on a novel, family came along, many things happened, but then I returned to it as the years grew, because I never took my eye off of the trends and the movements that Occupy set in motion. I think that was what was most, to me, I think that a lot of the world moved on, right? Inequality was the thing that Occupy injected into our national conversation and a global conversation. The haves and have-nots, the 1%, the 99. But then most people in the common understanding in the media moved on. Occupy was a meteor, it was a 2-month flame, and it flamed out, and then it kind of disappeared. But, I was an editor of Occupy.com, a later site that we started from the movement, and I followed and wrote about and edited all these movements that evolved, and I saw the trajectory. I saw in the Bernie movement and things we're going to discuss now, the climate movement, Black Lives Matter, so many things that our decade has birthed as a kind of a rejuvenated American democracy, which is sort of the point that I followed the story, and I felt like I needed to tell the story accurately document what I feel needs to be history's mark of Occupy. There was a journalist at the New York Times, Andrew Ross Sorkin, the financial journalist,
Yep.
New York Times, who wrote in the 1-year anniversary, and it always stuck in my craw, I never liked it, to say that at the 1-year anniversary, Occupy will be an asterisk in the history books if it is mentioned at all, if it gets a mention at all. And it always felt like, it did more than that. And as we followed the trends, now we can see a decade later, as I try to show in the book, what it helped birth.
I absolutely understand. It does seem like you're writing, like, kind of to respond to that popular notion, as you say in the opening, like, what happened to Occupy? Was it just was it kind of an inspirational moment and then it flamed out? Did it come to nothing, as like so many people liked?
I think you're on mute, Michael. You're on mute to me. I hope I'm not on mute. I hope people can hear me. You went out there.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm sorry. So I was just saying that you were really kind of talking to what you said, what happened to Occupy, talking to that popular conception of, well, nothing really happened. You were arguing a lot happened. And so you mentioned politics. So let's talk about politics. Your openings, one of your opening sections is Occupy Politics. And you talk about how the mantle of Occupy really was taken up by Bernie Sanders, by Elizabeth Warren, by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I just, Bernie and Warren, of course, were candidates for presidential nomination for the Democrats. They did not win. We have President Biden instead. But I think that your book makes the argument that, far from dissipating, Occupy really fueled the next decade of democratic change.
Right.
If you could talk a little bit about that and how that really, like, how do you see that as playing out?
Yeah, I mean, that is at the core. I think that's what makes this book, maybe there's several elements that maybe make it relevant today, especially, but I think I think when people ask, what did Occupy actually do? Okay, it gave us the conversation, but what has it changed? I think there are a number of things it changed, and we can get into the labor issues and climate and the various movements, but one concrete, really remarkable change was that it remade, as I like to say, the Democratic Party. We didn't have a progressive wing, as they call it now, of the Democratic Party. When the Tea Party happened the year before Occupy in 2010, it immediately, through the help of the Koch brothers and the right-wing machine, it got turned into, kind of manufactured into a political movement that sent people to Congress, sent people to state houses, and essentially hijacked the Republican Party and veered it in a kind of a Sarah Palin, direction that eventually led to Trump, in this really reactionary, far right, wanting to do away with government essentially in many functions. What Occupy did was precisely did not enter. It had a built-in contradiction. One of its core contradictions was that it wanted to change the politics of the country, but it refused to become political. It would not enter the electoral arena. It did not have leaders. It did not have an agenda. But what we saw so quickly after Occupy was Elizabeth Warren, as you just mentioned, 2012, the year after Occupy, she rode to office on an Occupy-styled message of the 99%, of reining in banking power, of regulating corporations and really making the bankers pay for the financial crisis, bailing out homeowners foreclosed upon. Warren took that message and she started the grand shift of drawing the Democratic Party to the left. People like Bill de Blasio came in as the mayor of New York with his campaign about the tale of two cities and inequality. And mayors and people across the country started to write legislation. They tried to pass legislation in Congress, which didn't go very far, but already the momentum was started, that the conversation had unlocked. No one had dared to criticize capitalism and actually put front and center the systemic problem, the crisis that capitalism and Wall Street greed was ruining our democracy, was not just manipulating it, but full-fledged controlling it through policy, shaping all the policies and obstructing progress for the people. What we really saw was the breakout of Bernie Sanders. And I think that in my interviews with people, they call him the Occupy candidate. Many people refer to him, later in retrospect as an Occupy candidate. He transformed the message unlike anyone. He took this language of the billionaire class, inequality, rampant greed, corporate, CEO excess, and the country was ready to hear him. And I think what was echoed many times in the chapter that I write on politics is that we wouldn't have really taken Bernie seriously. He would be shouting into the wilderness as a democratic socialist from Vermont in his 70s, the way he'd been doing for decades, the way guys like Paul Wellstone years ago did, or Dennis Kucinich. People just don't take truth-telling, progressive, deep progressive seriously in the past. And Occupy changed that structural lens. It gave Bernie, it gave the people the ability to hear and the readiness and hunger to hear. And of course, what came out of Bernie was one of his young volunteers on his Bronx office, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was inspired by his message, who went to Standing Rock, signed up, got elected, knocked off the fourth most powerful Democrat in the Democratic caucus in New York, and then led to this entire wave and a generational shift where now we have these progressive Democrats who, the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, fight for $15 wage, student debt-free college. These are issues that Bernie, AOC, and the whole trend have drawn into the mainstream. So that is my argument sort of in the book in a nutshell of how Occupy reshaped the party and American politics.
Yeah, no, you do a very compelling job in this section of tracing some of the the inspiration and really the power behind some of these very progressive candidates, as you say, kind of breaking into mainstream discussion. I just want to pull back from a moment from that and just, we had Bernie and we had Warren. They're not our president right now. Obviously, we have President Biden. I think that President Biden would, you could say that he was not the Occupy candidate. Is it too much to just say, well, that shows a limit to the Occupy's reach, or is it just a longer game than that? And we're looking at some of the things. I mean, I've been interested to see the kind of President Biden has been versus maybe what he might have been, you know.
I think to just cut to the chase with it a little bit, I think that the big stimulus, I think that what he wants to do to be a so-called transformational president, which I do believe he really intends to be, whether our own Democratic Congress will allow him to be. What we're seeing with Joe Manchin is a play out of kind of Clinton era Democrats, even Obama era, center, right, conservative, practically Republican Democrats who are now gumming up the works. I think, though, that Biden rode to office, he was forced to the left because Bernie made him run to the end, and Warren, and he adopted the Green New Deal style policies. He wants to raise the federal wage to $15. He wants childcare and free community college. I mean, these are the real deal. And I think that if Congress were able to pass this massive budget bill, 3.5 trillion, I think people are going to look at the Occupy legacy as something that really has helped concretely change not just the politics and the people we put up to elect, but literally provided the spring, the jump off for this massive transformational generational policy in the model of a FDR style of remaking the country economically. Then we would see more than just the rhetoric of inequality. We would actually see, hopefully, a balancing of the scales. Which
you talk about Occupy in the book as a taboo breaker in many different ways. And so let's talk about the economy and more specifically labor in that respect. You say that because of Occupy, for the first time in 3/4 of a century, people came out and openly criticized capitalism in the United States. And said the system is broken. We can't go on like this. Too many people are getting hurt. So it kind of really broke that wall of silence around inequality, and labor was in the center of that. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, how that conversation kind of generated there in Occupy, and how that conversation has continued out of that moment. Like, I think the widespread recognition that we have now that inequality is rampant and not doing good things for any of us really is
yes.
part of how we think. So yeah. So how did that transform that conversation?
Occupy, like it reshaped our politics, I think, on a profound level. And I don't think it gets this credit necessarily, but I think my book, I try to really trace this decade-long arc. It opened up the new workers' front. I mean, yes, 75 years since the New Deal, really, America went into hyper, capitalism. It was working and it did its job. It made us the juggernaut and the leading economy on the planet and all the rest. And frankly, no one in positions of power felt that they could legitimately criticize this successful system without getting just the scorn of the establishment and being turned into a pariah. But workers, of course, weren't always doing so well. Since the 70s, and particularly starting in the 80s, Reagan crushed the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and the rollback for union rights, the shipping of jobs overseas to China with NAFTA underway with Clinton. We see, and I try to draw this arc of the last 40 years especially, profound sort of degradation of the labor movement, where so few people now even are part of a union. I remember at Occupy, it was in the third week at Occupy Wall Street in Foley Square, the day when organized labor came out. It was the day that transformed Occupy from a student, a white, liberal, middle class, college age, all the sort of monikers it had for who occupiers were, unemployed young people, et cetera. It became the working rank and file. Tens of thousands of people came out, unions from across the city. And I think what we saw in that spark was organized labor realizing, no one's been watching our backs for decades, Democrats or Republicans. And if anyone's going to look out for the 99%, it's going to be the 99%. It's got to be us who come out and march for our rights and demand higher pay, better conditions, more stable jobs, health and lower health premiums. Companies like Verizon, Communication Works of America, many companies came out. They were the early leaders. But what really I try to show is how occupiers themselves from Occupy Wall Street, 1 year later, after the closure of the encampment, were instrumental working with unions, community groups, clergy in organizing the first fast food workers, which was then known as the Fast Food Forward campaign, into walking out from Wendy's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's in New York City. That was the birth of the Fight for 15. That movement exploded overnight across the American landscape. And people tuned into the next chapter in the inequality debate. We got the $15 minimum wage on people's sort of nightly news channels, and it went from dozens of cities to hundreds of cities to a global movement. And we've seen it go all the way up, as you say, Biden, into practically making it into his coronavirus stimulus plan that he signed back in March, the 1.9 trillion one. It didn't, but it made it to that level of discussion. We also saw the Walmart worker strikes that demanded, and occupiers were instrumental in helping fuel those strikes and organize. And Walmart workers realizing they needed to stand up for their rights. They're living in poverty wages, living off of food stamps while working full time. They got a raise. The world's largest retailer gave them a raise because of that mobilization. Domestic workers, hotel workers, airport workers, clerks, adjunct professors at colleges, people got into the ruckus. And in 2018, the teacher strikes culminated this sort of movement of worker demands. And the teachers in red states, starting in West Virginia, moving to Kentucky and through Tennessee and the Carolinas and Arizona, the red state revolt, as it became known, or Red for Ed, they won wage increases across the board. And it really hasn't slowed down. And I think we see in the coronavirus economy that people are not willing to make minimum wage and sacrifice their health and well-being anymore. There are better things for them to do. They're looking elsewhere. And I think we're on the cusp of, the scales have begun to balance. And if we can get policy to match with that, like the Pro-Union Act that's on the Congress passed, but not the Senate, we would see more significant change. But that's happening. Labor movement has been re-energized, galvanized. And I like to think that Occupy had some part in awakening the 99%.
So, I mean, all these issues that you delve into are so difficult and complicated, and for so long seemed so immovable. But I mean, what you've been able to do, and I think that people are getting a sense now that this is really a optimistic book. I mean, this book is so full of a sense of change can happen, right? And even at a time where it just feels like optimism is in such short supply. So that's one of the, I think, remarkable things about this book. So that being said, let's move on to the climate chapter and talk about the climate crisis in regards to Occupy. You also write about how Occupy kind of revamped the climate movement in really profound ways. So what do you see as Occupy's role in the new generation of climate activists and the new movements? And you've mentioned the New Green Deal a little bit, but if you could expand a little bit on that.
I think that optimism, good word, good underused word these days. We do need it, and I think that if you turn things around and look at this last decade from this perspective of things growing and building, this seed that was planted in the minds of people that has sprung into wholly unexpected sort of form, and gained momentum and changed and improved on itself. The climate movement is a place to see that really in focus, from Occupy to the Green New Deal. The man who kind of steers that chapter, I tell this book as journalistically, like reportage, and it really, that chapter is based on, one of the founders of the Sunrise Movement, which is the Gen Z. It is the movement that occupied Nancy Pelosi's office twice and scored hundreds of arrests, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came to their protest, and several weeks after that launched the Green New Deal in coordination with this youth Gen Z social movement and senators. And it was kind of affirmation that social movements are no longer just yelling in the street and shutting things down, traffic down for a day. They're actually in the halls of power. This transition didn't just happen by itself. They were trained. Evan Weber, the guy who I chronicle in the book and follow through, he marched at Occupy Wall Street on the very first day when they marched down to the Trump building. And then he was one of the co-founders 7 years later of the Sunrise Movement, and that is now sort of the new incarnation. It's important to remember back that there really wasn't a climate movement per se in America. There was an environmental movement, but it was the Iraq War years, and all of the oxygen kind of got sucked out of the room in the anti-Iraq War protests. The anti-globalization movement had sort of dissipated. The Iraq War, the foreclosure crisis, people were left sort of, we knew the climate crisis was upon us. There wasn't really a mobilized, there were young people going out to paint bike lanes and encourage you to buy a less emitting vehicle and eat less meat and all these kind of personal actions. Finally, it all sprang into view, and the two movements, the environmental movement that at that moment was the Keystone XL pipeline fight, and Occupy, they coincided in the autumn of 2011. And I was there I took a bus from New York to Washington on one of the really spectacular protests against the Keystone pipeline, in which this new activist energy, this really a kind of a fearless and the ultimate demand, we will not leave until you hear us, that was Occupy's sort of ethos. It infused the environmental movement. The Keystone movement that scored over 1,000 arrests over several weeks, it birthed really the modern climate movement in this moment in which Keystone kind of became the victory. It took 6 years, but they got that quashed and Obama vetoed it. But the depth of mobilizations that occurred and the amount that Occupy people participated in the new climate movement, the more radicalized, more militant, people blocking coal trains, stopping gas and coal export terminals across the Pacific Northwest. They went down one after another, these massive fossil fuel infrastructure projects, because people on legal fronts as well as activists organized, and it was the Occupy people as well who were either in that or who spurred that new energy. The fossil fuel divestment movement that is now worth $15 trillion globally, that has been divested from fossil fuel, that started on college campuses months after Occupy sort of spurred this wave of activism. Standing Rock, the community, the water protectors that stood for 10 months, indigenous people that really flagged the whole world's attention and got the support of so many people across America. And then all of that transformed into also Sunrise and the climate strikes that Greta Thunberg helped lead, that will, we think this September, actually reemerge ahead of the big UN climate summit. The global climate strikes, millions of young people, Extinction Rebellion. It is a vibrant youth. This is the existential issue of our time. And so many people I talk to feel like if an Occupy emerges, another Occupy, a new movement, something different, but something almost universal and overwhelming to the system, something that really stops things in its wake, then it's going to have to be like a climate movement. And I think that the new younger generation's ability to both use tactics that Occupy showed, but also to learn from its mistakes, learn from what Occupy got wrong, and create demands and form policies and get into the political process, elect leaders, force campaigns through. So I think that we've seen a lot of optimistic, the climate is still our peril of our time, but there's a lot to be hopeful about.
Absolutely. So Occupy kind of changed the landscape of protests of what activism could be or might be in the future. It kind of changes the rules of how to make a fuss, how to get angry about things, and how to maybe have an impact. One critique of Occupy that I wanted to throw out there is that it was, or at least the perception was that it was kind of mostly kind of young, white, well-educated movement, college educated kids. It didn't have a lot of the working class that it wanted to fight for, maybe in its ranks. At the same time, right, Occupy has drawn a lot of connections to the Black Lives Matter movement, and you write about this in the book. You write about the critique, but also the connections, and try to make sense of that. So, can you explain here, I guess, some of the fundamental differences that you see between Occupy and BLM, but also some of the ways in which they share maybe a common history and some energy together?
Yeah,
And,
I think
and
that
also the other social movements that followed
yeah,
as well.
that was a very sensitive, kind of delicate part of the book, because activists really hesitate to equate or bring those two together. Occupy Wall Street, largely white fueled movement about economic inequality. Black Lives Matter, largely people of color, communities of color, but the connections are really quite present when you look at it, at the people who involved themselves in both, and in the ways that Occupy, it was kind of a correction for a lot of people from Occupy, which it really didn't have the 99%. It didn't incorporate kind of Black, Latino, it didn't bring in sort of those elements that really are the working class and the 99%. The moment Black Lives Matter happened, I think that the connections were unmistakable. Black Lives Matter drew from so much of the organizing, the infrastructure, the technology, the decentralized movement organizing that Occupy pioneered through its use of social media, through live streaming, protests and police brutality in the streets, through sharing it out and kind of making a viral movement from scratch on the streets that goes from protests in the streets onto people's screens at home and draws out more people into the streets to create this sort of this loop. Occupy sort of invented that because the technology happened to come in right then when we had a cell phone in our pocket all of a sudden. And Black Lives Matter just built on that and changed it again, corrected on some of Occupy's mistakes, like the structurelessness and the leaderlessness. Black Lives Matter put much more sort of emphasis on tangible, we want these changes to law enforcement to stop the indiscriminate killing of unarmed Black and brown people, men mostly. It had real concrete goals, and it corrected, and I think it learned, and people I talked to, Maurice Mitchell of the Working Families Party, I mean, they studied what Occupy sort of got wrong at Black Lives Matter and improved on it, corrected. And what we see is so many Occupy people at the same time got into Black Lives Matter, helped fuel the virality of it at the beginning, the tech element, putting live streams out there. They had that infrastructure already. So they had marches, Occupy people organized Black Lives Matter marches. They fused very much in different ways. But I think when Black Lives Matter happened, we saw and recognized, I certainly did, that it was affirmation that Occupy really was just a beginning. Because Black Lives Matter was, I think, really the first major movement that came after Occupy. But after Black Lives Matter, which began, people might not remember, it began as far back as 2014, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. People think of it now with 2020 and George Floyd, but 2014, after that, we saw Standing Rock, which was indigenous-led movement where people joined, and again, white with indigenous people with all kind of races, all met up there. That's where AOC got her start, by going to Standing Rock. And then you see women's movement, you see Me Too spring out sort of nowhere, but people I talked to for this book, feminists and people who've studied the issues really say that even Me Too had the ground really laid ahead of it by Occupy, because Occupy delegitimized the 1%. And Me Too, would we have been able to take down Harvey Weinstein, these millionaires and billionaires, the Roger Aileses, and other Fox, you know, the giant media personalities. Could you really take down these really, you know, the sleazy 1%, the men who are abusive? I think Me Too, people feel like Occupy gave that, it got people ready to hear that debate. The inequality debate shifted to inequality of treatment of women and women's rights. And then you get the Women's March, and you get Indivisible, the group that emerged as an antidote to Trump, that helped organize, again, decentralized protests across the whole country to basically shoot down the Republican effort to abolish Obamacare in Trump's first year of office. It's hard to remember now, we've gone through so much, but Indivisible, they used really, they were much more political insiders who started it, but they used the same techniques that Occupy kind of pioneered, of decentralized organizing, Women's March, you know, millions of people all in their own cities doing it on their own. It gave that courage. I think that one point I try to end the book on is Occupy gave people courage more than anything else, the ability to not sit stagnantly at home wanting things to change. If you want to make real change, it's sort of, you go out in the street, you put your body out there. Civil disobedience, it brought it back. And just for the new generation, I think that I said the climate strikes, of course, but also the March for Our Lives, you know, the young kids from Parkland who are teenagers, 16 and 17-year-olds. When in America have 16, 17-year-olds marched out of school by the millions, masses of them nationwide? And guess what? The NRA, which is another 1% sort of, you know, same as an Occupy idea of controlling the politics of Washington, they are not what they were just 2 or 3 years ago. They are on the outs. They will never have that influential place governing our political establishment sort of on the Second Amendment issues the way that they did. So all of these are sort of the movements that Occupy helped spur.
That might be true, and I think that's very eloquently said. But I think that one of the lessons is that the influences of the movement, it's hard to see what ramifications that might be. And you just mentioned it yourself. And one of the things that was kind of the elephant in the room here is President Trump. And to what extent can we connect his rise and his kind of the phenomenon of him to Occupy as well? I think that you talk to many people in the book that kind of try to puzzle over this, and some people say without Occupy you wouldn't have Bernie, but also without Occupy you wouldn't have Trump. And
Right.
so it's a very interesting tension that I think that Occupy had huge impact on, and in some ways it was uncontrollable what it unleashed. And so could you just touch on that briefly here, about how you reconcile that?
Yes, and then I know we're going to take some questions, so I'm conscious of that. Yeah, Trumpism and Trump, that was an inconvenient intrusion into the populist left ascent of the teens. Yeah, Trump really brought, but he really does represent, you know, what did Occupy do? It sort of, it said the elites. I mean, what Trump said is the elites are laughing at you, right? To his people, to the Trump base, his elites that he criticized were the media. They were Hollywood. They weren't the same as the elites that Occupy criticized, which were on Wall Street and financial greed. But Trump also hated the hedge fund managers. He had scorn, you know, to dish out for a lot of the, you know, he was, of course, the quintessential 1%er, but obviously his people didn't care about him being a billionaire. They just wanted to hear him rail against the ruling class, or at least the corrupt elites that he did. He rode that message. He and Bernie were like a couple of racehorses, neck and, you know, that spring. I mean, we all remembered, I think they were both completely different from Hillary Clinton, who was the establishment message, couldn't even basically break from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a huge global corporate pact that she, you know, supported, whereas Bernie and Trump both firmly opposed. It was like they each shared that, and they made it clear to their base that the 1%, or at least the ruling class, the elites, are out to get you, and or are illegitimate and that need to be toppled. But what I think is interesting, and the time when I talk about Trumpism is really globally. You know, the book kind of moves, really it's in America based, but I try to end it towards the end with a global look at Occupy's global impacts. And of course, as we know, those of us who have been watching and following, the right-wing, reactionary, xenophobic backlash has been global. It's a European phenomenon. It's a South American phenomenon with Brazil and other countries in Latin America, but really in Europe, where we see it all over, from Hungary to Poland to Spain and Italy and England and you name it, Holland. And Trump, of course, fits right in with that backlash, anti-immigrant and xenophobic and anti-globalization. And so I think that what people were so angry about, Occupy spurred this global movement also. There was Occupy Gezi in Turkey. There were student protests across the Americas, Montreal, in Mexico, the Yo Soy 132 movement really got a boost from Occupy. It kind of modeled itself. It was called the Mexican Occupy. And other movements, the Brazilian bus fare rebellion that they called the Brazilian kind of Occupy, where people just rose up ahead of the World Cup when corruption and misspending was revealed and people had inequality on the mind. So the world kind of did this Occupy. It wasn't all Occupy, because Occupy came from the European movements initially, from the Arab Spring and the Spain and Greek rebellions against austerity. But after Occupy, there really was this leftward tendency and trend, and rebellion was in the air. But just as Trump kind of came in to curb that and move things to the right, that happened globally. And we saw that across the global landscape, where the right-wing forces kind of came in and used that same hatred of the elites, skepticism about whether globalization really benefits you, the people, at all, or if it's just screwing you and taking your jobs overseas. But I do think one last global point is that the Hong Kong rebellion that Occupy helped, it was called Occupy for Love and Peace, and it turned into the Umbrella Revolution and a years-long rebellion against the Chinese regime in Hong Kong, now really in sort of dire condition, given what the Chinese are doing in Hong Kong, and sort of crushing that whole pro-democracy movement. But that was another legacy of sort of Occupy. And I even spoke in the book with people who went over to Hong Kong and helped the Hong Kongese, the students organize. There's a lot of these connections, this global ferment. The last decade was really filled with it. And I think to probably close things out, actually, so that we give people a chance to ask questions, I would just say that a takeaway is kind of that, the youth movements and the rebellion sort of against the status quo, everything that started with Occupy, I think that the 20s are really the period that we might see, and I hope we do see, really the fruition of a lot that was started back then. It's such a tumultuous era. It reminds us of the Weimar Republic and Germany before, the Nazis came to power. We hope that in this case, the progressives really do their job at this moment and sort of prove with policy that we can change America and improve the lives of people, so that the right doesn't have an excuse to sort of hijack the government, as they attempted to do 9 months ago. But one person who I talked to for the book, Kevin Zeese, who died last year, right as I was finishing writing the draft of the book, and he was a great organizer and really he was at Occupy DC. But one of his things that he said, and he's a lifelong movement person, was, movements don't reveal their impact in the first years, and maybe not even in a decade or two. They can take a generation to show what, to let the ideas that began at one moment actually produce changes in society. And I think that we might, that patience is important, and that the 20s is the period when we could really see the takeoff, because people are getting in power and the young people have gotten educated, and we can't unlearn the 99%, and people are ready to get things done and roll up their sleeves, as we saw in the 2018 midterms and onward. We're saving our democracy here, and hopefully we see improvement, coming from there.
Thank you, Michael. Just wanted to follow up lastly, just wrap things up. I also wanted to let people know that right now we have we have one question from the audience. So if anyone else has questions, now's the time to get them in. And while I give people a minute to ask a question if they have one, I just want to Yeah, I just wanted to take kind of take off from where you just left off, Michael. I want to ask, I mean, yeah, 10 years, we're 10 years out from Occupy. It may or may not be long enough, as you say, to render a verdict on what the true legacy of it is, how transformational it will be or has been. Um, but as you say, a lot of the readers I think that you might be hoping to talk to are people that might not remember Occupy itself 10 years ago, and that's the next generation. Is that generation Occupy? Are you generation Occupy? Are we all generation Occupy? Who is generation Occupy?
That's a great one. Good ending point. Yeah, right. Well, I'd like to think that we all at this point, whether we like it or not, are kind of generation Occupy. We're sort of in this. We didn't ask for it, but we're kind of in the fight for our lives here, for our country, for our democracy, for our planet, for the rights of people to have a house and afford their rent and afford their food and have health care. I mean, we are at this break point that I think Occupy um, recognized and allowed the mass of people to recognize. It was the awakening of the crisis, the recognition. And now I think whether we like it or not, we're sort of generation Occupy. This is the era. I guess I would say, young people really have so much. They're ready to kind of take. They've got to be ready because there's no other option. But I hope that maybe if the book outlives this moment and the previous 10 years, looking ahead, I hope that it provides guidance for people looking to see how movements can evolve and improve on themselves, not be kind of stuck in dogma or in kind of a didactic in debates. I mean, the self-destructive elements of movements is really a tragedy, frankly, because if movements didn't, if the left didn't tear itself apart, we would be further along than we are now. We got to learn, and young people have to learn how to not get stuck and bogged down and really obstructed by their own, wish for how things internally could look and sound like, and really get motivated by the planning. I think that Occupy kind of provided that blueprint by failing to change things in its moment, and by pretty much dissipating from the scene. It, in a sense, was like the phoenix, right? Like allowing the ashes to rise again. It did burn out, and yet people were able to take those lessons and think about it. And I hope now, 10 years ago, tomorrow being the 10th anniversary, September 17th, I hope people take the opportunity. I hope Occupy gets a fresh look, and that the historical record sort of reasserts itself, that, yeah, it's time for young people to look at what happened in the past and build on it, improve on it, and go march on.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent. Let's take some questions from the audience. So I have a few here on the feed, and I'm going to just read them, and you can respond if you choose to. So the first one comes from Mickey Hoff, and he writes, "Great conversation, great presentation. Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Oakland and around the country at once was ignored by the corporate media and the political establishment, yet they gradually had to address it. So they attacked it as leaderless. Though that was some of the strength of the movement. That said, the corporate establishment was scared." Can you comment on that? And the meme of the 99% versus 1% is still with us, and it's a vital expression.
Yeah.
Infiltrated Occupy. Comment on that.
Question. What I mean, the 99% is definitely still with us. Yeah, COINTELPRO, I guess, style infiltration. It definitely helped take down the movement. I think it was a combination. Occupy Oakland, since we're talking locally here in California, Northern California. I mean, that really had kind of disastrous implications in a way. Whether it was infiltrated, no doubt it was. But the sort of disorganization that was unleashed here. I wasn't here when it really happened. And of course the police provoked it, and the mayor sort of invited, Mayor Kwan, I think it was back then, invited the police in to just sort of go to town, go to work and clear that encampment it looked like a war zone. I think that was the lasting memory. But I remember that Chris Hedges, one of the real, writers, longtime writers of the left, and wrote that the black bloc that sort of emerged at Occupy Oakland, he called it the cancer of Occupy. And I addressed it in the book. This was a really controversial theme naturally during Occupy. And I remember people debating it. He got really dished on by the far left, by anarchists, by everyone. But it really was he hit on something really important, which I think, again, we saw in Black Lives Matter last summer, when we saw sort of massive property destruction, fires burning across Seattle, Portland, and in the aftermath of the great and popular George Floyd protests that were Black Lives Matter, you see other elements that really do far greater destruction to a movement in terms of the public's perception of it than the movement itself did. I think Occupy had that self-destructive element of really the confrontations in the street, where it forgot that the fight was against the banks, and it became a fight against the police. And can you mobilize and can you evade police in the streets? That's not a winning fight. I hope that movements sort of see, it didn't win. It certainly helped lose Democrats and lose this progressive majority that might have helped really push through this progressive agenda. Democrats barely escaped by the throat, from the 2020 elections. A lot of it was because of just the rampant sort of chaos, apparent chaos from elements that may look like they're from a movement, but are really sowing more destruction in a way that it just isn't productive for a movement to grow and succeed. So anyway, I know that Occupy Oakland is so, it really has a mixed legacy. And I marched here when I came back in the winter to the port blockade, another controversial event that Occupy Oakland put on. But I think it tried, and it was really powerful. It was aggressive and radical, Occupy Oakland. It was a great force that united the movements across the country, coast to coast, but it also proved quite kind of destructive, self-destructive.
All right, thank you. So the next question comes from Karina Yaffe. What were the worst cases of interlopers hijacking the momentum and enthusiasm of Occupy? What should future protesters do to regroup when misguided hangers-on steal the focus? Any advice?
Advice from the observer journalist. I think that kind of goes to the point I just raised. And I think that really actually talking about future movements and the fundamental working through the past and learning from the past, learning from what Occupy got wrong, elements of Black Lives Matter got wrong. I think that is actually a pretty key. It's something people don't like to bring up, but I think finally the ability to contain those really volatile elements, which seem to always make their way into social movements, especially very energized and physical ones. I think that probably may hold the key to whether a larger movement that sweeping in scope that can take the US public with it, like a climate movement. If a climate movement is great and has, 80% public support or 70 or even 60%, but then at the end of protests, people go out and do the same things that they've been doing since the 60s, since Abby Hoffman and the Chicago Convention, and the same things that sort of are immediate. It's really falling right into the hands of the people you want to kind of defeat or change. It's falling into the police's hands. They need to learn. I think that movements probably need to develop more self-protective elements of some people who are kind of the guardians. I think people talked about that during Occupy, in the descent of Occupy, when people were reckoning with how did we let this out of our hands so easily or so quickly. And a lot of people said we need movement guardians, people who are going to sort of help preserve this great message of the 99% and not let in those destructive elements. But of course, the left is going to fight that out too. But there's got to be, because it's like excluding people who sort of have a right to be in there. But I think there needs to be absolute more discipline. I think that discipline is how movements now are creating policy and driving policy. It's not through the more chaotic style.
I find it interesting that a lot of these questions actually have to do more with the counter Occupy aspects. So here's another one. This is from Adam Bessie. What do you make of the irony that the anniversary of Occupy takes place on the same day as the upcoming pro-insurrection Justice for J6 protest this weekend?
My goodness, it does. Thank you, Adam, for reminding us all. The insurrection celebration, or whatever it is, falls on the same day as Occupy. What do I make of that? I guess that makes for a bit of a combustible Saturday we're looking forward to. Well, no, Friday. I think actually you might be wrong, Adam, because I think tomorrow is the day of Occupy and Saturday might be the day of the Trumpers. But look, the Trump stuff is yeah, it's what I ended the book on, my afterword, which I labored to write and struggled with, as some of you might know. I think I had to acknowledge that the Trump movement and the insurrection, it somehow did play a part in the Occupy story, because this idea of occupying the Capitol, this radicalization, of course, it came from proto-fascist, xenophobic, white nationalist, QAnon conspiracy folks who are completely off in their own universe compared to versus the mainstream. They are in their own realm. They represent a strong element in America, but they did they used the language of Occupy. That was the extent that they used Occupy, but it was this idea of occupying the Capitol. And I sort of presented the idea that the future really hinges, our future, democratic future in America, hinges on which of these sides. Is it going to be the insurrection side, the side that takes bloody mallets and invades our state houses and kidnaps our governors and hangs our vice presidents? Is that going to be the future, the insurrectionary future? Or is it going to be the peaceful, the nonviolent, civil disobedience, and quite vocal and aggressive, but really committed to a democratic transition toward greater equality and justice? They're really two fundamentally different approaches to change. And I think we're going to see it play out. I think that, frankly, the progressive, the Occupy tendency just has a lot more legitimacy and support. I think this far right one clearly will have to be dealt with for years to come. But it's just so mad that I don't see the people going with it. So we'll see how it plays out. We're all going to be watching, right?
All right, next question from Tyra Beno. She said, thanks for your optimism and your historical perspective. You make the point that this was primarily a white college-educated movement. What percentage were male in the original Occupy movement? And what I see, she says, what I see in the local Sunrise Movement or the international climate movement is a far higher percentage of young female activists. And I'm curious if you found that in Occupy as well.
I think it was largely seen. I certainly remember lots of women involved at Occupy. I think to call it, white male, I think it probably was. I think if you broke it down, it was, and certainly for the people who say led discussions or kind of steered the movement or were in backroom, were the ones who were taking more of a leadership role in the leaderless movement. I think men probably really were, and women were not listened to as much, et cetera. I think that the current movements like Sunrise and March for Our Lives and others, they are putting women front and center. I think it's a strategically wise and smart. I think the organizing that women themselves are doing in these movements is helping galvanize them, is helping really keep them, give them this strategic focus, and not sort of become kind of a every person speak for themselves, sort of the loudest voice in the room. I mean, Occupy had profound problems. I don't dwell on it in the book. I don't need to rehash. I think everyone knows, because we don't much talk about Occupy anymore. It had problems, right? And one of them was that the loudest voice could talk and not stop talking. But I think that new movements I think they're going to be cognizant of that. Yes, Occupy had a white male thing. And I think that Black people noticed that. I think women noticed that. But look at the movements that then took charge. Black Lives Matter, Women's March, Me Too. Other movements have come and said, all right, we saw what could happen. Now we're going to steer it and lead it.
All right, good. And just to wrap up, okay, last question from Catherine Myring. How is your involvement in Occupy, how has your involvement in Occupy changed you as a journalist?
Good one to end on, Kathy. Thank you. Changed me as a journalist. I think it really did redirect my focus. I think I was a much more, I kind of made a conscious choice when I entered, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, when I entered Zuccotti Park and was on my way. I had a divorce to take care of with my Spanish wife of the time, and I was headed back to Berlin. And I thought of maybe covering the protest movements there, but I really didn't know quite what. Things were really in flux in my life and in the world. But somehow that decision to shift, because I'd been writing for a lot of mainstream publications, Financial Times, and places where you kind of really got to toe a pretty centrist presentation of events and facts. I think that when I veered and saw what Occupy was and committed to writing for the movement, about the movement, not as a journalist outside of it, but really in it, because that's where I just needed at that point to be. I think it did kind of rewire me to the point where I never, I had to continue to make a living, and I blogged, I wrote for companies, I did, clean energy became my sort of focus, writing about it, but I never went back to mainstream journalism exactly after that. And it did veer me into the, what can I say, into the more hardcore element of journalism, of wanting to make impact with writing and with reports and try to change things in the way that Occupy kind of, it turned my mind on the way it turned on so many others, to the need for us individually to do our part. And as a journalist, I think I saw that. As a teacher now, teaching young students and journalists to think of what is the lens, how do you want to frame? You got to be objective and balanced and neutral and fair, and yet how do you convey what really matters? How do you drive some positive change and impact? So it's kind of shaping how I teach now as well. So thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Michael.
This has been such a compelling conversation. I have just enjoyed it so much, and so have so many of our attendees. Scarlett says thank you, Mickey says thank you. We're getting, endless comments like that. And thank you to all of those who asked questions, really good questions. Just to remind everyone, yes, this is being recorded. You will all receive an email tomorrow with a link to this recording. It will also include the details about tonight's title, previous works by Michael, the discount code. So if all you did is watch, no problem, we've got you covered. And on that, Michael, I was hoping you'd take us out and thank you to both of you, and we can kind of wrap up on that.
Big time. Thank you, Michael Howerton, longtime journalist, great man and friend who spent much of the pandemic in Italy, and much of it devoted to writing, and is now back bearing the brunt of the 2020s with us here in the Bay Area, and doing it very with great grace and style. Thank you, Michael, for helping lead this. But thanks to Copperfield so much. I'm a Sonoma County native from the West County, from Forestville, and Sebastopol Copperfields, Santa Rosa Copperfields, Petaluma Copperfields. I've long time been a purchaser and just really admired independent bookstore that has kept the flavor, the feel of a real book loving people, and putting on and bringing people. So I would encourage everyone, if you could, to support a great store like Copperfields, and continue to in your own area too. Independent bookstores are the prized cultural possession that we have. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Absolutely.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Hopefully we'll have you both back in the near future in person. So with that, I hope you all have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks to everyone for showing up. Thank you, really.